Hey everyone, Jeremy with AE Screens here, and in this video I'm going to be showing you all the features of Type, which is a tool set that helps you with text layers inside of After Effects. So here I've got the Type panel, and this is responsive, so I can stretch this out to be as wide or as narrow as I want, and I can dock it anywhere I want. I'll just go ahead and dock this right here. Now you can also customize which buttons are visible, so under the settings, under the UI tab, you can check off any of these buttons if they're not important to you, or if you're just wanting to clean up your workspace. So first, with this text layer selected, I'm gonna hit this typewriter icon. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna animate each character coming in one by one. So by default, it's set to animate by character, but you can change that to word or to line. And if I hit U on the keyboard, I can see these keyframes. And so it's just animating from 0 to 100%. I'll go ahead and change this back to characters. And you can also change the timing of this just by moving the keyframes, or you can go into the settings. And then under the animations tab, you can change this typewriter animation length. And so this is in seconds. So if I change this to 1, then if I delete these keyframes, the next time I apply typewriter, it'll just be a 1-second animation. I'm also going to be using this button throughout this video. So this is a remove effects button. So this is just going to basically remove anything that type has done to your text. It's going to remove it. So I'm just going to do that to start from scratch. Now if I were to hold shift while I hit this, it's going to just add the typewriter effect, but with no keyframes. And then of course you can add the keyframes yourself. All right, so next is this blinking cursor. If I hit that, it's going to add a shape layer, and I'm just gonna zoom in so you can see this. I can select this shape layer and change the color. I can make it a bit thicker, just so it shows up better. I can toggle this rounded cap. That's gonna make the edge of the smallest side rounded. So if I were to make this, let's say, much wider and shorter, then those rounded caps are going to be on the sides rather than the top and the bottom. So this thickness is based on pixels. So maybe I want 100 pixels, and then this height is based on the size of your text. And so maybe I'll make this a little wider, and then this offset is just going to reposition this, but this is all going to stay locked to your text. So if you change your text, it's still gonna stay to the end of the text. Back here, now the blink duration, that's how long the cursor will remain visible, and then how long it'll be invisible. So right now this is set to 15, and my comp is 30 frames per second, so that means every half second it's gonna blink. But if I were to change this to 5, that's gonna be a much faster blinking animation. Next is text alignment. You don't really need to worry about this. This gets set automatically once you add blinky. Just be aware that if you change your text, let's say you had it centered and then you change it to right align, that's gonna just throw off the alignment. So if you do that, you just wanna make sure you change it to right aligned here. So next is this detect spaces toggle. And what that does is just respects any spaces you have in your text. So if I click on this text, you can see the bounding box around my text. Now, if I were to add a space around this, you can see that the cursor moves because we have detect spaces on. But if I select this again, you can see that the bounding box actually remains the same. And that's because After Effects doesn't treat spaces the same way they treat other characters. So just make sure that's on if you want the spaces respected. Otherwise, you can toggle it off. And then RTL is if you are using a right to left language like Hebrew or Arabic. You can toggle that on, and then this is going to shift to the other side. Now, when you add the blinking cursor, it's also going to add the typewriter effect if you don't already have one. And so then you can just animate the text being typed out. Or if you wanted to add the keyframes, you could just use this typewriter button, and that will do it for you. Or, once again, I'm going to remove all the effects. If I hold Shift and then click this, then it's going to add the keyframes automatically based on where I am in the timeline. One other thing I'm going to point out with the blinking cursor is that when your text is being animated, typed out, that cursor is going to stay visible, just like it would with most word processors. Now, since this text has multiple line breaks, there's an extra guide layer that gets made. So if you make sure you can see the shy layers, there's going to be this guide layer at the bottom. It's not visible, but it helps Blinky calculate where it should be. All right, so this next button, that's going to make your text flow up. So if I just play this back, you can see that just naturally the text is flowing down. So we have this layer and then the next layer goes beneath it. But if we click this, and it's not going to do anything initially, but if we go back, we can see that the text now flows up. And if instead we wanted to have it flow from the middle, we could hold Shift and click this button. And now if we go back, it's going to flow from the middle. Just keep in mind that wherever you are in the timeline, it's going to keep that position. So if I were to, let's say, click here, now it's going to flow up from there. All right, next is highlight, underline, and strike through. And these all obviously do different things, but they work pretty similarly. So with highlight, obviously we can just have the text selected and then hit highlight, and that's going to highlight the entire text. And so underline works the same way, and strike through also works the same way. Now, instead of applying it to the whole text, we could also just select a range of text and highlight that. Or same thing with underline or strike through. Now, if we wanted to animate any of these, we could just select the text we want, hold Shift, and then it's going to create this animation. And just like with the typewriter effect, I'm going to pull up U. This is a 1 second animation, but I can change the defaults here. And so we can change the defaults for each of these individually. So if I were to change this underline to 2, and maybe I want the strike through animation default to be 2.5. Now if I hold Shift and add an underline animation, that is going to be 2 seconds. And then if I hold Shift and do the strike through animation, that's going to be 2.5 seconds. So what this is doing is it's just creating a stroke. And so you could actually go in here and edit the stroke however you want. And when you do the animation, it's just adding a trim path to the entire stroke. Now you could also change the color or change the thickness. So by default with highlight, it's going to be set to 100% of the cap height. And cap height is just basically what the height of a capital letter is with your font. And so again, you could go in the settings, and then under strokes, you can change the default height. So if we wanted this to be a little taller, maybe we want 120%. Now, when we highlight text, it's just going to be a little bit taller. We can also add extension, and so that's going to extend it from the left and the right. So if we just say, just to really exaggerate this, I'll do a 50 pixel extension and then do a highlight. That's just going to add this extra 50 pixels on each stroke. Now you can also customize the default color. And so obviously this is set to yellow, but you can change that to any color you want. Just make sure you just put a proper hex code in here, and that should work fine. Now with the underline strike through, you can either use a hex code, or right now I have it set to match text color. All right, so let's just say we change this text to a different color. So I'm going to go with like a lime green kind of thing. And then if I were to underline, that underline is going to be the exact same color, and strike through as well. Now if I toggle this off and then redo that, now it's going to be black because that's the color I have set. You can also change the thickness, and so that's just going to be the weight of your stroke. And then extension, which is the same thing I showed with highlight. And then with underline, and this is just affecting underline, the padding is how much space it'll be underneath your text. So right now it's set to 0, which means it's going to butt right up against the bottom of your text. But if you wanted to give it a little breathing room, maybe you could do 10 pixels, and then we'll just see how this looks. All right, so that's pretty cool. And again, all this works whether you want to highlight a specific range of text or whatever. Now I'll point out just the way this is working is it's looking for whatever text you highlight. It's just going to look for that specific word. So let's just say I highlighted the word is and then tried to do any of these functions. It's actually going to underline is and this because that's the first instance of it. So you just want to keep that in mind. And if you run into that problem, a simple solution is just to include some of the spaces around and then add the animation. You can also just move this layer around freely too. Next is this rectangle tool. And so what that's going to do is just create a rectangle around your text, and it's a live rectangle. So if I were to change this text, so new text, I'm just going to change this background to be give us a little bit more contrast here. So yeah, this is live text, and I can change this to whatever I want, and the rectangle is gonna follow the text. And this also works with the typewriter effect, which is pretty cool. So if you click at this rectangle, you can play around with any of these effects. So auto X, that just means it's gonna automatically track with the width of your text, and then auto Y is gonna track with the height of your text. If you turn these off, it's just gonna look at whatever your margin is set to. And margin is just going to give you extra padding on the sides, or you could also take this in if you wanted. So you could set it to a negative number. And then offset just moves your box around. And then this ignore ascenders and descenders, what that's going to do is when you toggle this on, it's going to ignore those. And so that way, when things are being typed out, the height of the rectangle remains the same. That looks fine. If I were to turn this off with the live text, it might just look a little weird because that box shifts up. So typically if you're making buttons or something like that, you want to have this checked on. And then maybe you want to add a little margin, or you can take it in, whatever. Now you can also change all of these defaults under the settings. And so under rectangle, you can also give it a stroke by default or remove the fill completely. And then I'm going to just keep these settings how they are. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And then one other thing you can do is hold shift and then click this rectangle button. And what that's going to do is create a rectangle that is not live. And so the reason you'd want to do this is maybe to create a track mat. And so I'm going to add this as a track mat. And then maybe I want to animate the position, and I could just easily do that, and I have a perfect mat. All right, next up is this number rig. And so you can either apply this to an existing text layer, or if you have no text layer selected, it's going to make a new one for you. I'll just go ahead and apply it to the one we're working with. So it's going to apply this effect to your text layer, and then the number here is just going to be tied to whatever this number is. And so you can keyframe this number. And so I'm just going to maybe count from 1, and we'll add a keyframe there, and we'll go forward a bit. And I'll set another keyframe at 100. So now we can see this number is counting up, and there's no decimals, and by default that's just how it is. And so if we wanted decimals, we could specify how many we want. So maybe we want 2 decimals, and now we see those and it's locked in place. Now if we had a bigger number, so let's just say 1,000, and we're going to 2,000. Now those decimals are still there, but now we also have this 1,000 separator. And so you can customize what you want this to be. So maybe in your country, you use periods for the 1,000 separators and commas for the decimal separators. You can customize that however you want. I'm going to just keep that as commas and periods. And then you can add a symbol. So you can add a $, and that's going to put it before your number. You could also add a percentage, and that's going to put it at the end of your number. You can also do custom leading. And so now this text should look familiar, and that's just using whatever text you actually have in the text field. So I'm just gonna double click my text layer, and I'm just gonna do a pound key. And so now that pound key, because I have this set to custom leading, it's gonna just insert that before my number. Now if I change this to custom trailing, it's just gonna put it at the end. Now when you're working with negative numbers, you normally have the dash before them, but financial will just wrap the number in parentheses instead, and it'll keep the symbols outside of those parentheses. And then fixed digits, that's just going to add a fixed amount of digits before your text. So if I set this to 5, that's just going to add a 0 because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits, and so it just remains 5 digits the whole time. So if you're animating like a password or something like that, that might be useful. And then we have big numbers, and so if we check this abbreviations box, that is going to add abbreviations once we reach 10,000 or more. So I'm just going to go ahead and change this. We'll start at 5,000 maybe, and then we'll bump this up to, I don't know, a lot of zeros, 10 million. So we can see that this automatically just adds the K once it gets into the thousands and the millions, and then eventually it would do billions and trillions. The abbreviation decimal is how many decimal places you want to show once you're using an abbreviator. So maybe you don't want to have any abbreviations when you're using whole numbers. So you could change this to 0, and that's just going to be 5,000. But then once it reaches into the big numbers, you still might want to use a separator there. So that's just separate from this number. Finally, this power of 10, that's just basically an easy way to add a 0 to the end of your number. So if I were to change this to 1, that's just, again, adding a 0 to the end of the number. So you could also, instead of animating the number itself, I could delete this keyframe. I could change this to a 1. And since this is already set to 1, that makes this number 10. So I could animate this, and I'll go from 0 to 10. And so that's going to animate this number from 1 to 10 billion, but it's going to do it exponentially. So depending on what you're doing, that might be a better way to animate everything. Now you'll notice that this animation is really shaky, and that's because I'm not using a monospaced font. And so luckily with Type, it includes a monospacing feature. Again, I'll just play this back and you can recognize this shakiness, and then I will just click this button, and that's going to add monospacing. And so now if I play this back, everything stays locked in place and it all looks good. Now this M is a little too close to the number. So another feature that comes with the monospacing is if you hold Shift, it's going to add a variable spacer. And so I'm going to change this to be right to left, and then it's just going to count from 0 to 1 and target this character, and then I can change the spacing just for this character. And so maybe I want to bump this up to 100 and separate that M from the rest of the number. Now over here, we don't want to separate the numbers at the beginning. So what I'm going to do is actually, I'll just keyframe this. I'll set it to 0. I'm going to hit U to pull up that keyframe. And I'm going to set this to a hold keyframe. And then I'll scrub forward to whenever that K comes in, right there. And then I'll change it to 100. So now if I play this back, it's looking good. Now, next is this counting rig. And so this is similar to the number rig, but it's just for counting time. And so this is neat because it doesn't require many keyframes. So this just animates automatically based on the time of your layer. So if I were to move this layer, you can see that the 0 is right at the start of this layer. And so by default, this is going to be set to 100%. So you can see I'm at the 4-second mark, and right here it's showing 4 seconds and 0 milliseconds. So I could change the speed. If I were to change this to 200%, then it's going to just be twice as fast. And so now I'm at the 8-second mark. You could also change this to a negative number. So I could change this to -100, and then I have a countdown. The only thing is that we're at 0. So we need to change the start time to be something higher than 0. So we can make this, let's say 1 minute. And then now we're counting down from 1 minute. Now, of course, if we're doing a 1 minute timer, we probably don't want to have days, hours, and minutes. So we can go down to display and toggle those off. And now we have this nice timer. We also, maybe we want to show this 1 minute timer right at the beginning. But then once we're below a minute, we want to get rid of that section completely. So we could just turn on auto claps. And then once we get beyond 1 minute, the minute marker is just going to disappear. You can also customize the colons. And so again, this is going to work the same way the number one did. It's just going to replace the colons with whatever you have typed out. So, maybe you want a dash or whatever. Now, just like before, I might want to add monospacing to this. And I just wanted to show one more feature with the monospacing. So let's just say I wanted a spacer just around that colon. Well, I could want to make sure I'm going from right to left and then 3 to 4. And then I'll set this to a negative number. And so that's going to tighten everything up. Now, once you have variable spacers, if you wanted to delete one of those variable spacers, instead of deleting everything, you could just hold Shift and then click the remove, and it's just going to remove the last variable spacer. Now, if you were to just go ahead and delete this, you're gonna get some expression errors, and so that's why I included that, just to make it a little easier if you are wanting to make a change. All right, so now this last button, this is going to split your text. So if I just have my text selected and click this, it's going to split each word into its own layer. And then I could hold Shift, and that would just do each line. Or I could hold Shift and Command, or Control on a PC. So Command Shift or Control Shift, and then that's going to separate each character individually. Now you also have some options when you do this when it comes to parenting. So let's just say I had a null object and I had this layer parented to the null object. And let's just say I had some animation going. So I'm just going to add some keyframes. It's going to be a little random, but you'll get the point. All right, so that's all animating on the null object. Well, if I go to settings, under the split text, you can see a few options. So I could delete the original. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, so I'm just gonna leave that off for now. And then under the parenting preference, I can either parent to the original. And so if I have that selected, then when I split the text, it's just going to parent all of these to the original. And since the original is parented to the null layer, everything will animate properly, even though these are just individual layers. I could also change this to inherit original parent. And so instead of parenting to the original layer, it's going to parent to the original layer's parent. And so in this case, that's the null object. And so again, this all works great. And then another option is to parent to the first word, line, or character. And so what that's going to do is just each of these are their own thing, but then this first word is going to control them all. Now with this option, this first layer isn't going to be parented to anything. So if you have animation going, you'll probably want to just add that parenting manually. All right, and then the final option is daisy chain parenting. And so what this does is it'll parent each layer to the layer above it. And so if I move this, nothing's parented to it. But if I hold this after button, then the effects is parented to it, and you get the idea. So that is Type for After Effects. I had a lot of fun making this tool, and I hope you guys get a lot of use out of it. If you have any questions or run into any problems, please email help@aescreens.com, and I'd be more than happy to help you. Until next time, take care.